Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Christopher Paul, who is a senior social scientist at the RAND Corporation and professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Prior to joining RAND full-time in July 2002, Paul worked as an adjunct at RAND for 6 years and was on the statistics faculty at the University of California, Los Angeles, also known as UCLA. Dr. Paul has written over a dozen monographs related to operations in the information environment. Chris Paul, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Oh, thanks so much, John. I'm happy to be here and super excited to talk today.
Today, we are going to talk about your very popular, highly cited, and influential 2015 co-authored piece called The Russian Firehose of Falsehood Propaganda Model. And as I was doing some background research about our discussion today, I came across a couple of interesting tidbits, and I wanted to use this as a bit of a jumping off point. But so the Firehose of Falsehood, and I clued in on the word falsehood, and I immediately started thinking about the rather well-known quotation that's attributed to Jonathan Swift, who was a early 18th century, I believe he was a satirist, but he wrote a piece in the early 1700s and has the famous line in it that says, "Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it." And I looked up that piece so that we could cite it and put it in the show notes, which of course we will. And that piece actually contains a reference to a much earlier poem by Ovid called the Metamorphoses. And the Metamorphoses has also been a very influential piece throughout the ages, with others, including Shakespeare, using Ovid as inspiration. And I wanted to read this little bit of Ovid's poem because it also is very relevant to the kinds of things that we're experiencing today, especially related to disinformation. And this is my me putting on my orator hat so this is a little excerpt from Ovid's Metamorphoses. "With idle tales this fills our empty ears. The next reports what from the first he hears. The rolling fictions grow in strength and size, each author adding to the former lies. Here vain credulity with new desires leads us astray, and groundless joy inspires. The dubious whispers, tumults fresh designed, and the chilling fears astound the anxious mind." And I guess I, went through all of that just to make the point, which is probably pretty obvious, but people have been lying to one another before the written word, from day one. So on one hand, lies and disinformation and falsehoods are nothing new, but obviously we are talking about, some new features that are unique to the information age. So all of this was a long preamble, and I would love for you, Chris, to talk a little bit about the origin story for your 2015 Firehose of Falsehood piece.
Sure, and I love those quotes because it points out and highlights what you just said, that propaganda isn't new, disinformation isn't new, humans manipulating other humans isn't new. Russian propaganda isn't new. Back in the Cold War, part of their active measures efforts involved quite a bit of propaganda. But what is new is the firehose part, the number of different modes and media and channels that they can use to spread propaganda, and the technology, the breathtaking scope. So we can talk more about that, but I'll get to the origin story. So this work came out of work Miriam and I started in 2015, when I had the occasion to look at some of what Russia was doing in the information space, what they had done in Georgia, what they were doing and had been doing in the Ukraine. And I was surprised and embarrassed. And I was a little bit embarrassed because I was ignorant of a lot of the things that they were doing, which was embarrassing because I'm an information professional. I am supposed to be watching this space. And so to have one of the US's major competitors or adversaries engaged in the information environment in a way that I wasn't fully aware left me concerned. And gee, if I, as an information professional, didn't know about it, then what about my fellow Americans and their general level of awareness of this? And the thing that I was surprised about was the fact that so much of it was falsehood based. Because I come from an influence and persuasion background grounded in thinking from World War II, where Voice of America broadcast information, but they took painstaking efforts to make sure that it was true and credible, and that their information prevailed because it was true and credible and built on that credibility and was able to convince their audience that they gave good news and bad news, but true news. And so I thought, perhaps naively, that in mass communication, credibility is king, and in some sense, the truth will always win. Yet here was Russia spinning a lot of false tales, making up a lot of information, and enjoying some success doing it. So that's when I got together with Miriam Matthews, who's a social psychologist, and we dug into what the experimental literature in social psychology has to say about effectiveness in persuasive communication.
Yeah, so you two got together in the 2015 timeframe, and so this was before disinformation became a household word for us, and obviously before the 2016 elections, which was the catalyst for making it a household word. How did you guys come to in the 2015 timeframe to think about studying this at that time?
But candidly, serendipity. Had the opportunity to look at Russian disinformation, realized I was seeing something different than what I expected, and thought about writing it up, wrote up this little paper, didn't expect it to be that important. And then, as you say, in 2016, all of a sudden, many of my fellow Americans became aware of and concerned about Russian disinformation. And in fact, I'm told that this paper was one of the most downloaded things from RAND's website in 2017.
Yeah, well, wow, good for you being at the right place in the right time, and well, you've also contributed all kinds of new thought to the body of literature on the topic. So, yeah, this one just happened to land, as you said, serendipitously. So, would love for you to talk a little bit more about the social science behind disinformation. But before we began recording this conversation, you mentioned, for example, that there is some deeply rooted science as to how information gets into people's minds. What sticks, what doesn't. Could you take that wherever you'd like to go, please?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to start talking about Russian propaganda and its characteristics. And again, as I mentioned, many of these things were things that Russia was trying to do back during the Cold War, but in a media environment where there were a countable number of newspapers, an accountable number of television channels, an accountable number of radio stations, they just couldn't get the volume. But the new model has, to our observation, 4 salient characteristics. The first is that it's high volume and multi-channel. And when I say channel, I mean channel in the broadest possible conception of the word. A single social media persona, whether it's authentic or inauthentic, is a channel. Of course, a television station is a channel. A YouTube channel is a channel. A social media feed is a channel. A radio station is a channel. And Russia is on all of these all the time with incredible volumes of content, overwhelming quantities. And that's where the fire hose thing came from. Like the old expression, trying to get a drink from a fire hose. Here, they're not trying to get a drink, they're trying to get everybody all wet. And the second major characteristic follows from that it's rapid, continuous, and repetitive. They're willing to use the same content over and over again. Their internet research agency, their famous troll factory that runs 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. And gee, if you're not worried about factuality, you can always be the first to report on an event. Or put another way, if you make something up, you will be the first to report on it. Then the third major characteristic is that Russian propaganda doesn't make any commitment to objective reality. It's not necessarily true. It's often false, but maybe it's backed up with some kind of manufactured evidence. Or it's false, but it's consistent with the narrative frames that the audiences that are likely to be exposed to it are likely to accept. Or it's false, but they somehow do something to increase the apparent credibility of whatever source is presenting it. And then the final characteristic is that it makes no commitment to consistency. So here in the US, traditionally, we've spent a lot of time in our defense apparatus worried about information fratricide, making sure that the left hand isn't saying one thing and the right hand isn't saying something else, that we're not contradicting ourselves. This Russian propaganda model doesn't worry about that at all. On different channels, they'll be telling totally different lies. On the same channel, the same speaker may, separated by minutes or hours or days, contradict themselves. They don't worry about consistency.
Yeah, that is stunning. That something that is so random can be just blasted out into our social discourse, which is now facilitated by social media and perhaps even traditional media these days as well. But how it can be so effective at sowing confusion and divisiveness within a target population.
Yeah, so can we talk a little about why it works? I apologize, that's what you asked earlier, but I wanted to say more about what the it was before we talked about why it works. And if we go through each of those 4 points, there's relevant literature in the psychological research. So first, if we talk about high volume and multi-channel, there's lots of research that shows that the number and the frequency of messages affects how persuasive and influential they are. Basically, quantity has a quality all its own. And there's research that shows that receiving multiple arguments from multiple sources is more effective at persuasion. But one of the interesting things is all the different influence and persuasion studies all agree that the most persuasive source is someone like you. And if you could see me, you could see that I'm making air quotes when I say like, because there's lots of different dimensions of likeness that could be mobilized. Maybe someone is like you because they come from the same town you do. Or maybe they're like you because they're a fan of the same sports team you like. Or maybe they appear to have the same religion, or they have facial features or the same hair color you have, or maybe their avatar picture, which may or may not actually be them, looks like someone you would like. So all these different possible dimensions of likeness. Now, what are the odds that a single government spokesperson has some of those characteristics in common with members of the audience versus what are the odds that one of the thousands, if not tens of thousands of false personas managed by Russian trolls, or the anchor persons on various news media, or all the other different channels and real and fictitious individuals that appear there? What are the odds that one of them is like any given member of the audience? The numbers are on Russia's side. And then Russian propaganda is rapid, continuous, and repetitive. Well, first impressions really matter. We all know that first impressions count. We've all heard of the first mover advantage, but it's really easy to underestimate just how powerful the first mover advantage is. Some of this has to do with how we as humans store information. So imagine I receive a factoid, and that's the word I'll use for something that is presented as fact, but may or may not be. So I receive a factoid, I accept it for whatever reason. Either I think it's true or my guard is down and I'm not on guard, so I accept it. Well, I don't take that factoid and write it on a mental index card and file it away in some mental filing cabinet. Human cognition is more complicated than that. I embrace that factoid and I kind of fit it into and I bake it into my worldview, my holistic worldview. So now if you come along 6 minutes, 6 hours, 6 days later and tell me that that factoid is false, you're not asking me to go to my mental card catalog and find one index card and tear it up. You're attacking my worldview. So the burden on the disputer, the refuter, coming after that first mover advantage is much higher. You have to offer me a lot of compelling evidence to go into my worldview and gouge that out. And you have to offer me something to paper over the hole, fix it, make my worldview consistent again. The rapid and continuous nature is hugely important. So I bet nothing I've said to you so far is particularly surprising. It's not surprising that being first, being rapid, being continuous, being high volume is persuasive. What about the lying? That third characteristic of the Russian propaganda model is a no commitment to objective reality. Surely lying isn't persuasive, right? Well, fellow humans, I have some bad news. Turns out that people aren't particularly good judges of true versus false information. And I'm sure you've heard of Daniel Kahneman's famous book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, where he talks about system 1 and system 2 cognition, whereas system 1 is heuristics and quick shortcuts and laziness and things we do to kind of get through a day in which we're bombarded with thousands of miniature parcels of information. And system 2 is that slow thinking, that attentive, higher cognitive functioning. When we're alerted to something, we pay better attention to it. And sure, when we're actually engaged in system 2 thinking, we're harder to trick. But hey, most of the time we're rolling around accepting heuristics. And there's a lot of shortcuts we take. So imagine, for example, that you're watching some kind of broadcast, whether it's on the internet, on TV, or whatever. And up in one corner is some kind of logo that has the word news in it. And at the bottom is a rolling footer ribbon that is conveying a stream of words. And the video image is of a nice looking soundstage. And there's a reasonably attractive anchor person who is speaking in either unaccented or pleasantly accented English. You see that and your brain says news. And provided that anchor person doesn't say anything that's completely inconsistent with your worldview, you're probably going to accept it as true. So that's one of the many ways in which humans are vulnerable to falsehoods. Another has to do with weakness in recall. So imagine you receive a factoid and say it comes from RT, formerly Russia Today, and you know that RT is a Russian propaganda mouthpiece. So you take that factoid and you say, I reject that. Well, so now you have two pieces of information, the factoid in memory and the rejection of the factoid. But sometime later, say 6 weeks later, someone else may mention that factoid. And what you would like to happen is for you to say, oh yeah, I've heard that before and it is not true. But maybe in recall, those two pieces of information have been separated, the factoid and the fact that you rejected it. So maybe what happens in your brain and what comes out of your mouth is, oh yeah, I've heard that before. So even if at the moment of initial presentation you reject a factoid, you may still, because of weaknesses in recall, end up accepting it at a later point. And I could go on about other kinds of ways in which humans are vulnerable to being misled. But I guess just to finish the chain of four, how about consistency? Surely self-contradiction isn't persuasive. Well, finally, some good news. Self-contradiction isn't persuasive, but it also doesn't undermine credibility all that much. And in fact, the benefit of not having to worry about information fratricide, not having to worry about contradicting yourself, probably outweighs the small loss in persuasiveness from being contradictory.
Is there any study or consensus in your community about what the effect of disinformation, firehosed or otherwise, has been since, some point in the past, like say since the 2016 election? Is there any kind of consensus forming in the research community as to what is actually impacting social discourse?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hey, how effective is the fire hose of falsehood? And the shorter answer is we're not really sure. So in fact, I've actually done a bunch of research on how to do assessment of efforts to inform, influence, and persuade. And one of the cornerstones of good assessment is having a baseline. And one of the other cornerstones of good assessment is having clearly articulated objectives. Well, with the things that Russia has done, we're not entirely sure exactly what they're trying to accomplish, though we could talk about that, what they might be trying to accomplish. And we don't know exactly when they started or what the baseline was before they started. So we've already violated two of the critical principles of assessment. But that aside, there have been a bunch of efforts to try to measure their impact on the 2016 election, their impact on the 2018 election, their impact on the French election. And I guess my glib answer is they've been more effective than we would like them to be, but they've been less effective than they would like to be. And what the actual value is, there isn't a consensus about.
Okay, well, I mean, that's interesting. So someone who is playing a devil's advocate, or maybe even a critical role, would say, okay, well then, so what? I'm sure people back in the days when the printing press came online and information went from being primarily word of mouth with relatively limited transmissibility, or I should say slow transmissibility of information, to pamphlets being able to be printed, Bibles being able to be printed, and getting information into a wider audience. There were people back in those days that were probably decrying that this technology is going to be the end of us, but we, the royal we, made it through that period, and here we are today, alive and well. So what? This is a hiccup. This is a moment in time that we are going to get through and figure out, and 10, 20 years from now, people will look back at us wringing our hands, worrying about this, chuckling about, oh, those silly people in the early 20th century. What kind of response do you have to that reaction?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. First, there have been historical periods where trust in institutions, trust in media, trust in journalism, truth in journalism have ebbed and flowed. And in fact, that's one of the findings of a piece of research done by some of my RAND colleagues. Jennifer Kavanaugh and Michael Rich have written on truth decay and on the history of the ebb and flow. And remember the phrase yellow journalism? We got past that. So there have been historical eras with more lies and less general trust, and periods with improving conditions. But to the broader point about so what now, so we can't say with confidence exactly how effective Russian propaganda was with regard to the 2016 election. But what if we get smaller? One of the things that we mentioned in the report is an instance, and I may get the dates wrong, and I may get the names wrong, but I think it was either 2013 or 2014, in a parish in Louisiana, there started appearing on social media information that the local chemical plant had some kind of accident, some kind of fire, and there was a dangerous chemical plume spreading. And that was echoed on some other social media and then was picked up by a local news station and started some kind of panic and some kind of spontaneous evacuation. But it never happened. There was a chemical plant, but there was no accident that day at the chemical plant. There was no chemical plume. And digital forensics suggested that this was done by Russia. This was, from my perspective, a Russian weapons test. And they were effective at getting their message picked up by local media and spread by social media and at changing people's behavior. Some people got in their vehicles and fled.
Yeah, that's interesting example. It seems like that example that you just gave is contrasted by the kind of vision that I was having in my head before, where the fire hose metaphor is like you're blasting out disinformation to a very large surface area, a very large population to try to affect national discourse, national opinion. But it can, like you just cited, can be scaled down into a more of a surgical delivery to affect micro issues also.
Yeah, and part of the fire hosing is that you don't have to be selective. If you, at relatively low cost, broadcast a lot of disinformation, maybe for the vast majority of people, that's just going to wash over them like any of the other crap that they hear any given day. But there are some people who are going to be the right combination of predisposed towards it, the right combination of cognitively vulnerable because of lack of sleep or other conditions, and the right combination of predisposed towards action or behavior. And think of some of the things that were revealed in the Senate Select Intelligence Committee report about some of the Russian propaganda, the way people accepted various different Russian Facebook or Twitter handles as authentic grassroots US organizations and actually went to rallies or demonstrations that were not supposed to have happened but were planned externally. So although the big impact is hard to gauge, there are definitely instances of small level observable behavior change brought about by these efforts.
Right. And so in addition to the other challenges that you mentioned a few moments ago about studying the effects of information operations, disinformation, for example, having a baseline to start with, and you ticked off a couple of other items, but it seems like another, I would put this into a category of this being a chronic challenge for the United States and perhaps the West in general, is that the effects are most likely going to be something that has a long time span. It's not like you fire a bullet, you see the bullet hit your target and your target dies. It's not that kind of an immediate shot to bang type of a measurement. It's something that takes months, potentially years, and that is something that we are having to wrestle with. And that, and on top of that, there are cultural and societal and world changes that are happening that are completely independent, or depending on how you look at the global ecosystem, really everything is connected with everything, and everything is continually affecting everything else. But global change is happening regardless of whether or not disinformation campaigns are being levied at various different population groups. Could you take that and go wherever you want to with it?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that although it's easier to find these kind of short-term, immediate behavioral changes, from my perspective, the danger here is the longer-term project, the longer-term, as Kavanaugh and Rich described, truth decay. And I think this is part of what Russia wants. Remember, this is a nation of chess players, and Russia has been bombarding their own domestic audience with propaganda for decades. And so their domestic population is very skeptical of any source of information. And I think Russia would love to share that with the rest of the world. So I think one of their objectives in this propaganda model is a war on information, a war on validity and truth, a kind of nihilistic assault on the credibility of anything. And I think it's captured really well in RT's slogan, which is question more. Russia would love it if everyone questioned everything more, if no one knows what to believe and when. And the disinformation, both foreign and domestic, contributes to this. Trust in media is down, trust in institutions is down, and what happens in a society when no one knows what sources of information to trust? Well, then you go back to the human psychology that people trust people like them, but then you get these little echo chambers that may be repeating or believing collectively things that just aren't so, and have no real system to break into those bubbles and fix it. So I don't know what the long-term societal implications are, but I'm concerned about them.
For sure. So in your piece, you get into this some, and I'll let you break the news to the Cognitive Crucible listeners. But the inevitable question is like, okay, this is real. It's happening. We're unsure about some of the ramifications, but let's just say it's not good. And what can we do about it, Chris?
Yeah, no, let's talk about what we can do about it. And so in the paper, and so in this conversation, I'll torture this water metaphor a little bit. If this is the fire hose of falsehood, what can we do about it? And I guess the first piece of advice is don't expect to counter the fire hose of falsehood with the squirt gun of truth. Our current disinformation countering efforts, they're getting better, but they're still predominantly low volume and late. And that's just not going to cut it. We need to be more vigorously engaged in this space. And second, and I'll apologize in advance for torturing the water metaphor, but
no, go for it.
What can we do to put raincoats on those at whom the fire hose will be directed? So I mentioned the power of the first mover advantage. Well, what if we can get in front of that? What can we do in terms of forewarning or prophylaxis or pre-bunking or whatever we want to call it? So things like forewarning, naming and shaming, exposure not just of the falsehoods, better media literacy education, these kinds of things. And in fact, when I talk to spokespersons, folks at the Department of State Global Engagement Center or Department of Defense public affairs officers, I recognize that when you're an organizational spokesperson and someone else says something untrue about your organization, there's an obligation to get up behind a podium and set the record straight. And I also recognize that psychologically, that refutation has almost no value. It just does basically nothing. So I urge those individuals when I talk to them, I say, hey, I get that you have to stand up here and do this, but spend as little time in your refutation in the actual retraction and refutation, and as much time as you can warning about the next one. Pick out the actor, give their history of falsehoods and attempted manipulation, and warn us about the kinds of things they might lie about coming up in the future. Now, all of a sudden, you've seized the initiative. You've got the first mover advantage. And there've got to be other ways we can find to help put raincoats on those at whom the fire hose will be directed. So the third thing to think about when countering disinformation is to don't try to swim upstream. And what I mean by that is don't point your flow of information directly back up the fire hose. When we say counter disinformation, we presuppose that in order to be effective, we have to somehow attack the lies themselves. But instead, think about the effect the lies are having. So I do mostly defense work. So if I imagine that I'm concerned about the way Russian propaganda is undermining Latvian confidence in NATO, well, if I'm concerned about that, rather than trying to stop the propaganda, maybe instead I should undertake some kind of efforts to increase Latvian confidence in NATO. I can counter the effect of the propaganda without having to actually get into a fire hosing match with the propaganda. A fourth, hey, let's increase the flow of positive information. Let's compete. Let's get out there. And I applaud the efforts of the Global Engagement Center and new efforts in the Department of Defense and other kinds of efforts in civil society to be more active in this space with the truth and with trying to restrict the flows of disinformation. And that's the final piece of advice. And the final torturing of the water metaphor. When we can, let's put kinks in the hose.
Okay. Very good. From the
Yeah.
fire hose of falsehood to the futility of using squirt guns to put out the fire to raincoats. Awesome. Good stuff. So the Information Professionals Association is one of our goals is to be part of catalyzing a whole of government or a whole of society effort to address the overall information problem, the information challenge, and the cognitive security challenge. So when you think of a whole of society effort, what kinds of things come to mind for you, like that the average citizen can do in order to be part of the solution, or certainly not be less likely to fall prey to disinformation influence?
Yeah, I like the way you describe that as a whole of society effort, because there is no single silver bullet policy change and there's no single approach. It's got to be a multi-pronged approach going after efforts to disrupt the dissemination of the falsehoods and the propaganda and the disinformation, to interrupt their transmission and to make audiences more resilient. It's going to take lots of different actors doing lots of different things. But within that paradigm of thinking about kind of three different points of intervention, there's a lot of opportunity to increase resilience. Things that help prompt recipients to engage their higher level systems thinking. So some of that is training and education, and maybe even civics education for the youngsters on how to recognize the different approaches to manipulation so that you recognize it when you see it. But then I'd also like to see, either voluntarily in the social media platforms or encouraged through regulation or standards, more tools to help users spot the disinformation. Things like, I'd love to see, what's it called? NewsGuard has a browser plugin where you get either green shields or red shields for the veracity of information. I'd love to see that as a default setting in a lot of browsers. I'd love to see more of what was it Twitter did this month, where if you go to like or forward something that is disputed, it makes you it pops up a verification. Are you sure? Hey, this has been disputed. Are you sure? So not something that censors people. People still have their freedom of speech, but just one extra click, one extra moment for them to engage their higher functioning. Oh, this is disputed? Maybe I don't want to share it. And other things like that on that end. In addition, continued vigilance and vigorous efforts to put kinks in the fire hose and have terms of service violations invoked against various propagandists and other things like that. So I think there's a lot more to be done in that way.
Yeah, I concur. The kinds of things that you were just describing would be, I would characterize those as having a bit of a technological approach to engaging with people, like you said. Hang on, this looks like this may be disputed information. Are you sure that you want to share it? But in order for that pop-up to happen in real time, there has to be some pretty sophisticated data science that's driving that type of real-time social media capability. When I think of a whole of society effort, I think of not only what you were just saying, although you said it much better than I can, but also things like very simple campaigns. And I'm thinking of stuff like posters, like from the Navy, loose lips sink ships, or I think it was a World War I poster with Uncle Sam pointing his finger saying, "I want you." But those types of national poster campaigns to percolate into people's minds that there are things happening that are new, and victory gardens in World War II, things that help rally some kind of a national awareness, which can also probably have a positive effect.
No, you're right. It would be nice to see, and in fact, I've seen an Operation Security poster based on loose limps sink ships. It's loose clicks sink ships. So you can, everything old is new again. One of the challenges, however, let's not imagine that we can fix it just with extra support and resilience on the end users. And one of the things we have to overcome is one of these psychological principles called blind spot bias. I'll tell you, when I've briefed Firehose to audiences, there's a point in the conversation when I'm talking about the human foibles, when I can see individuals in the audience looking to the left and the right and saying to themselves, "Oh, you poor humans," not thinking that they themselves are also vulnerable to these kinds of things and manipulations. And it's tricky. So maybe some of these interventions, maybe some of this training has to actually show people how easily they can be tricked and manipulated so that they are more on guard themselves. But yeah, I'd like to see that. And I recognize that we do need some help from the technology, from the platform owners, from the algorithms, kind of traditional cybernetics, that human machine interfacing ways to get to better enable the human to activate the right part of their cognition to better deal with these challenges.
Yeah, fantastic stuff, Chris. I like to try to wrap up these conversations and ask our guests if there are any, you've already mentioned a number of items, and we'll have links to these in the show notes, but any other good books or research materials that interested listeners can go and check out if they want to learn more about these kinds of things?
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple thoughts. I've already mentioned Jennifer Kavanaugh and Michael Rich's book on truth decay, so I'll foot stomp for that. Another book that I've enjoyed and found really useful is by Kendall Haven, and it's called Story Smart: Using the Science of Story to Persuade, Influence, Inspire, and Teach. And it's useful to information professionals in two ways. One, it does talk some about how human cognition works and some of our vulnerabilities, but it also talks about how to do positive influence, how to better communicate your research findings or your policy advice to people based on the fact that we are all humans, homo narratus, the story people. And we store information in stories, and we receive information in stories, and how to leverage that. And then a final thought, if you want to geek out on propaganda stuff, the Sage Handbook of Propaganda, an edited volume by Paul Bames, Nicholas O'Shaughnessy, and Nancy Snow, back from 2019, has a lot of great articles and chapters in it.
Dr. Chris Paul, thank you so much for being part of the Cognitive Crucible, and I hope that you will consider coming back again someday.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure, John. Thanks very much.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.